The wind was a predator, a relentless thing of teeth and ice that clawed at the sod-roofed cabin. It found every chink in the dobing, every crack in the warped window frames, and breathed its frigid malice into the single room where Alara huddled with her children. Despair was a cold more profound than the Wyoming blizzard. It had settled deep in her bones, a marrow-deep ache that food and fire could no longer touch. Not that there was any of either left. The last of the cornmeal had been scraped from the barrel 2 days ago, boiled into a thin, watery gruel that did little more than mock the hollowness in their bellies. The fire in the hearth was a ghost of itself, a handful of sullen embers whispering their last rites. Alara pulled the threadbare quilt tighter around 8-year-old Leo and 6-year-old Cora, their small bodies trembling against hers. They had stopped crying hours ago, their hunger having passed into a lethargic, terrifying quiet. Their faces, usually flushed with the boisterous energy of youth, were now pale and pinched, their eyes large and dark in the gloom. She could feel the fragile beat of Cora's heart against her ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm that seemed to be counting down the seconds they had left. This was it, then. The end her late husband, Thomas, had sworn would never come. He had promised her a kingdom on this unforgiving patch of earth, a legacy for their children. But a fever had taken his promises and his life 6 months prior, leaving Alara with a mountain of debt, a barren larder, and the cold shoulder of a town that saw her only as another man's folly. They called her prideful for staying, for refusing charity that felt more like judgment. Now that pride had turned to ash in her mouth, tasting of failure and regret, she pressed her face into Cora's hair, the scent of her child a final, agonizing comfort. Tears she no longer had the strength to shed burned behind her eyes. A sob caught in her throat, a dry, rasping sound of utter defeat. It was then, through the mournful symphony of the gale, that another sound intruded. A solid, rhythmic thud against the cabin door. At first, she thought it was a branch or a delusion brought on by hunger. But it came again, insistent and real. A knot of pure fear tightened in her stomach. No one traveled in a storm like this. No one except perhaps Mr. Gable, the banker from Laramie, a man with a heart as barren as the winter landscape, coming to cast them out into the snow as he had threatened. Her body went rigid. She could not face him. Not like this. Not with her children fading beside her. She would not open the door. She would let the wind and the silence claim them. But the knocking did not stop. It was patient, powerful. A force of will against the storm's fury. A man's voice, low and muffled by the wind, called her name. Alara, the sound of it. A name she hadn't heard spoken with anything but pity or scorn for so long, jolted her from her stupor. It was a voice she knew, a voice she had buried under a decade of duty and practicality, a voice that belonged to a ghost. With trembling limbs, she disentangled herself from her children, her movements stiff and clumsy. She stumbled to the door, her hand hovering over the iron latch. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the knocking. Taking a ragged breath that scraped her raw lungs, she lifted the latch. The door groaned open, wrenched from her grasp by a furious gust of wind that sent a swirl of snow and ice into the cabin, extinguishing the last of the embers in a final, defiant hiss. And there he stood, a silhouette against the swirling white maelstrom, broad-shouldered and solid as the mountains themselves. The snow clung to his hat and duster, but it could not hide the weathered lines of his face or the unwavering intensity in his dark eyes. Silas. Silas Blackwood moved with the quiet economy of a man who wasted nothing. Not movement, not words. He shouldered the door shut against the storm's protest, the sound of the latch clicking into place a sudden, definitive seal against the howling chaos outside. For a long moment, he simply stood there, his gaze sweeping the room, taking in the empty shelves, the dead hearth, the 2 small figures huddled under the quilt, and finally, Alara herself. He saw the hollows beneath her cheekbones, the desperate pride in her eyes that warred with a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence. He didn't speak of the 10 years that had passed, nor of the broken promises that lay between them like a field of stones. He saw only what was right in front of him. His expression, carved from years of solitude and hardship, softened by a fraction. A subtle shift in the muscles around his jaw. "Get back to the children," he said. His voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the room's oppressive silence. It was not a suggestion. It was a gentle command, and Alara, her will eroded to nothing, found herself obeying without thought. She returned to the pallet, her legs unsteady, and wrapped her arms once more around Leo and Cora. She watched him, a spectator in her own home, as he unburdened himself. From a heavy canvas pack, he produced items that seemed like treasures from a forgotten world. A sack of flour, a slab of salted bacon wrapped in oilcloth, a tin of coffee, a small bag of dried apples. He didn't offer them to her. He simply placed them on the rough-hewn table as if they belonged there. Then he turned his attention to the hearth. With a hunter's knife, he shaved tinder from a piece of kindling he produced from his duster, arranged it with practiced care, and struck a match. A small, hungry flame leaped to life, and he fed it patiently, building it from a flicker to a steady, life-giving blaze that pushed back the shadows and breathed a tentative warmth into the frigid air. Alara's mind struggled to reconcile the boy she remembered. A restless youth with wild dreams and an easy grin, with the deliberate, capable man before her. That boy had spoken of leaving this hard land behind. This man seemed an inextricable part of it, as rugged and enduring as the granite peaks. He worked without looking at her, a silence between them that was heavier than any conversation. It was a mercy, she realized. He didn't ask how she had come to this. He didn't offer platitudes or pity. His presence was an answer, not a question. He sliced bacon into a cast-iron skillet, the hiss and sputter as it hit the heat a sound more beautiful than any music. The aroma filled the cabin, rich and savory, and Alara saw Leo's head lift weakly. Silas noticed. He cooked, then mixed a simple dough of flour and water, frying it in the bacon grease until it was golden. He knelt by the pallet, a plate in his hand. "Here," he said, his voice quiet as he addressed the children. "Eat slow." He broke off a small piece of the fry bread for Cora, his large, calloused fingers moving with surprising gentleness. The children ate with a desperate, animal urgency that broke Alara's heart, but Silas watched them with a steady, reassuring calm, ensuring they didn't take too much too fast. Only when they had finished and drifted into a true, restorative sleep, did he turn to Alara, holding out a plate for her. She stared at the food, her throat thick with unshed tears. Taking it felt like an admission of everything she had tried so hard to deny. Felt like surrender. But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no judgment, no condescension. She saw only a quiet, unyielding resolve. She took the plate. The simple act of providing, of sharing warmth and sustenance, began to mend a fracture in her soul she had thought irreparable. The blizzard broke 2 days later, replaced by a crystalline silence and a sun that glittered on the endless sea of white. The world outside the cabin was scoured clean, beautiful and treacherous. The reprieve, however, was short-lived. Just as the first meltwater began to drip from the eaves, a rider appeared, his stout gelding churning through the deep drifts. Mr. Gable. He dismounted with the self-important air of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He didn't bother to knock, shoving the door open and bringing the cold back in with him. His gaze fell upon Alara, then flickered with avaricious surprise at the sight of the stocked table and the robust fire. "Well, well," he said, a sneer twisting his lips. "Found yourself a benefactor, have you, Mrs. Hayes? It won't be enough." He pulled a sheaf of papers from his coat. "The bank's patience has expired. This property and everything on it is forfeit. You and the children will be off it by sundown." Alara got to her feet, her body still weak but her spirit ignited by a spark of defiance she thought long dead. "The roads aren't even clear, Mr. Gable. You can't—" "I can and I will." He cut her off, his eyes cold and hard as river stones. "Your misfortune is not the bank's concern." He took a step toward her, his presence filling the small space with menace. It was then that Silas emerged from the shadows near the hearth, where he had been quietly cleaning a rifle. He didn't raise the weapon. He simply held it, his posture relaxed but radiating an aura of absolute stillness that was more intimidating than any overt threat. Gable started, having not noticed him. "And who in the hell are you?" he demanded. "That doesn't matter," Silas said, his voice level and dangerously calm. "She needs more time." "Time is money, friend, and she has none," Gable spat. "I'm here for the land. Not a debate," he gestured dismissively toward the door. "Now, unless you have business here, get out." Silas took a slow step forward, placing himself between Gable and Alara. He was not a tall man, but he seemed to loom solid and immovable. "I'm making it my business." He reached into his own worn coat and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch, tossing it onto the table. It landed with a dull, metallic clink. "That's the last of the interest payment, plus 1 month's advance." Gable stared at the pouch, his eyes narrowing with greed and suspicion. He wanted the land, not the money. The railroad was rumored to be surveying a line through this valley, and the property would be worth 10 times the debt. "A noble gesture," he sneered. "But the foreclosure is already filed. It's too late. The land is mine." He made a move to push past Silas, his hand reaching for Alara's arm. In a motion too quick to follow, Silas's hand shot out and clamped around Gable's wrist. His grip was like iron. "No," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low, chilling whisper that cut through the air. "It's not." Gable's face paled, his bravado crumbling in the face of this man's unshakable will. He tried to wrench his arm free, but Silas held fast. He looked directly at Alara then, his gaze locking with hers over Gable's shoulder, and in that look was the culmination of a decade of unspoken history, a promise made silently across a chasm of time and hardship. He turned his eyes back to Gable, his voice low but carrying the weight of an oath. "I'm here for you," he vowed, the words meant for her alone. He then spoke to Gable, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This family is under my protection. You will come near them again at your own peril. Now take the money and ride out before you discover just how seriously I take my responsibilities." He released Gable's wrist, shoving him back a step. The banker stumbled, rubbing his arm, his face a mask of fury and fear. He snatched the pouch from the table, shot one last venomous glare at them all, and stormed out of the cabin, defeated. The immediate threat was gone. The air in the room settled, thick with unspoken emotion. Alara looked at Silas, truly seeing him for the first time not as a ghost from her past, but as the bedrock on which her future might be built. In the quiet that followed Gable's departure, the small cabin felt both vast and intimate. The confrontation had shattered the last of Alara's brittle pride, replacing it with a fragile, burgeoning gratitude that left her breathless. She watched as Silas calmly went back to the hearth, stoking the fire as if he hadn't just faced down ruin on her behalf. The simplicity of the gesture undid her. He was not a savior riding in on a white horse. He was a man mending a fire, a quiet force of nature who had decided to flow in her direction. She sank onto the small stool by the table, her hands trembling in her lap. "Why, Silas?" she finally whispered, the word barely audible. "After all this time, why?" He turned from the fire, his face illuminated by the warm, dancing light. The hard lines seemed to soften, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the boy he had been. "I heard about Thomas," he said, his voice low. "Then I heard the talk in town. Figured talk wasn't doing you much good. It was a simple explanation for a profound act, and it was all that was needed. There were no grand declarations, no rehashing of old wounds. The past was a landscape they had both traveled through to arrive at this single point in time. His presence was the only apology necessary, her acceptance, the only forgiveness required." She looked over at her children, sleeping peacefully, their cheeks now holding a touch of color, their breaths deep and even. A fierce, protective love surged through her, so powerful it was a physical pain in her chest. For months, that love had been intertwined with fear and helplessness. Now, for the first time, it felt like a weapon, a tool, a source of strength. She was not just a widow to be pitied or a debtor to be hounded. She was a mother, and her will to protect her children was as unyielding as the mountains outside her door. Silas's arrival had not saved her. It had reminded her how to save herself. He had given her the one thing she had lost completely: hope. He had shouldered her burden just long enough for her to find the strength to stand and carry it herself. She finally understood. True resilience wasn't about enduring alone. It was about the profound strength that comes from allowing another to stand with you in the storm. The cabin was no longer a tomb of lost dreams but a sanctuary, its rough-hewn walls holding not the memory of what was lost, but the promise of what could be rebuilt. Days turned into a week. Silas stayed. He spoke little of the future, but his actions built one, nail by nail, cord by cord. He mended the leaking roof, chopped a mountain of firewood that dwarfed her meager pile, and hunted, bringing back fresh meat. He showed Leo how to set a snare and told Cora stories by the fire, whittling her a small, perfect wooden wolf. He and Alara moved around each other in a quiet, practiced rhythm, a partnership forged not in vows and ceremonies, but in the shared work of survival. One afternoon, as a pale spring sun worked to melt the last of the stubborn snow, she stood in the doorway, watching him reset a fence post at the edge of their property. He worked with a steady, tireless strength that was a comfort to behold. She brought him a steaming mug of coffee, and he took it from her, their fingers brushing. A spark of warmth, entirely separate from the coffee, passed between them. He nodded his thanks, his eyes meeting hers. In their depths, she saw not the faded love of a bygone youth, but something deeper, more resilient. A love that had weathered a long winter and was now, tentatively, reaching for the sun. From inside the cabin, she heard the sound of her children's laughter, a sound she had feared she would never hear again. It was the sound of a new beginning. The vow had been made in a moment of crisis, but it was being kept here, in the quiet, ordinary light of every day.